Hi, folks. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is Love the System, the integral stage discussion series devoted to the so-called lower right quadrant. Systems, protocols, algorithms, economies, societies, collective intelligence, and interbehavioral dynamics. Today, we're sitting down with John Bunzl, founder of the Simpol movement. I know a lot of folks in the integral, meta-modern, game B, intellectual, deep web, rebel wisdom, neo-Bildung, and adjacent communities are sensing that Simpol holds an important piece of the civilization upgrade project. There is clearly a gap between the planetary scale at which capital flows and creates incentives and the scale of thinking and feeling that informs the instincts of individuals and national governments. So hopefully we'll close that gap a little bit today. Hi, John.
Hi there, Layman. Thanks very much for the invitation. Great to be here.
One of the main ideas that comes up in theories of cognitive development is that we have to turn the things that embed our identity into objects that we can inspect and respond to. So how important, how psychoactive is it to clearly name and identify destructive global competition?
It's critical. I mean, for me personally, it's almost like the lens through which I feel I can see the world in a truly world-centric way. Because I think, most of us in the Western world, at least, are we don't even realize how identified we are with the national level. So for example, if you hear a politician saying to you, well, this will keep the US or Canada more competitive, your immediate instinct to think is, oh, well, that must be a good thing, right? But when you're looking at that from a world-centric perspective, where you realize that all nations are competing destructively for capital, inward investment capital, multinational corporations, jobs and investment, you start to see, well, hang on a minute, what at the nation-centric level I saw as beneficial, now I can start to see that as actually potentially destructive. But so if you don't have that world-centric perspective, frankly, you're lost.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful, clarifying concept, because once you get your head around it, you start to see that like 90% of the news stories you see are sort of embedded in this concept, and people are trying to address it in a much smaller context than it's actually operating.
That's right, and I think we don't even realize, how embedded in the nation-centric level we are. Because after all, it's been with us since 1648, and for the last, ever since then, it has been the glasses through which we perceive the world, almost without realizing it.
I was trying to think yesterday about when the discussion about competitiveness was introduced as a main political conversation topic. Do you have any sense of that? And when the current phase of destructive global competition really started to emerge and get out of hand?
Yeah, I think it was really, the kickoff point was the Reagan-Thatcher deregulation of financial markets, because that just let capital go global, basically. And once you've done that, the genie's out of the bottle. Because as soon as capital is roaming freely and globally to wherever it can make the highest return, it's not difficult to see how that would bring nations into destructive competition with each other, almost automatically. It's going to happen. And that's when you see this rhetoric about international competitiveness becoming so prevalent. And so in the 80s and 90s, that was the age when left of center parties like Clinton and Blair and Gerhard Schroeder in Germany to some degree, it embraced this idea under the cover of third way rhetoric or some other sort of euphemism for a left-wing version of neoliberalism, and that's where they, that's the left sort of got sucked into that. I think Blair and Clinton in those days, when globalization was still relatively new, left-wing parties that embraced it actually kind of could, square the circle for a while because they were on the leading edge of the advantage. But then when you get someone like Macron, who comes along much later and tries to do the same thing, the boat's gone already. He's missed the boat, and now we're in a situation. I mean, he's not on the left, of course, but generally speaking, I think this is why you see left-wing parties or center-left parties, the Democrats in the case of the US, you see them really becoming almost impotent and losing, because they can't support the working classes, their traditional supporter base, because higher taxes on the rich and the corporations would send them elsewhere, would make the country uncompetitive. And so what have they got left? And I think that's part of the reason that the left has sort of accepted the booby prize of identity politics. Because if you can't really implement what you're supposed to be there for, that's what these parties, the Labour Party, it was called the Labour Party, if it can't speak to its core support, what else can it do but play identity politics?
Yeah,
so I think it's a disaster for the left.
It really goes uninspected, the degree to which the exaggerated modern global economy incentivizes the cultural arguments. Right? It's very easy to lay that at the foot of traditionalists versus postmodernists. But there's a strong incentive for the modernist system to make that be the conversation. Yes.
I mean, it's, absolutely. And really, the traditionalists, the traditionalists and the postmodernists, if they could understand destructive global competition, they would more easily realize that they would be on the same team. Because if you, it is the unregulated nature of the global market and the free movement of capital that is, creating this very unbalanced win-lose economy. And that is what is pumping people from the developing world up into the rich Western world. So the solution for what the left wants, which is greater wealth equality and solving climate change, would also actually be the same tool that would solve the mass migration problem. Because if you could tax these, the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks properly, and you could redistribute those funds more to developing countries so that people in those countries can make a decent living at home, which is after all what most people want to do, you wouldn't need to build walls. You wouldn't even need to have the discussion about should we keep them out or should we open the borders, because nobody would want to be crossing them, particularly except for a holiday. So I mean, I'm exaggerating, Layman, obviously, and I'm aware that I'm it's easier said than done, but ultimately we've got to go in that direction, and so that you're quite right that there's this, without seeing the world-centric destructive global competition context, at the national level, you're going to get the conflict between left and right, between globalists and nationalists, between, it's the mess we see right now. And the left and the right are just as crazy as each other, basically, the extremes anyway.
A lot of people who take Simpol are a bit frustrated that it doesn't include a set of policy prescriptions. And, I'd be curious to hear your impressions and insights about potential policy changes. But one of the things that makes it a very powerful lens for viewing the situation is that it's not concerned with policy content. It's charting out a set of dynamics and incentives that would allow policy to be implemented at a planetary scale.
Yes. I mean, it's not concerned with specific policies at this stage, but it will be hopefully at a later stage.
Well, why don't you, could you walk us through how you envision those stages playing out a little bit?
Yeah. So the first stage that we're at right now is simply the stage of getting politicians and citizens signed up to this idea in principle. So we're inviting citizens to sign up, and we're inviting politicians to sign the so-called pledge to implement the simultaneous policy if and when sufficient other governments are on board. But there is actually no policy content yet, as you quite rightly say, Layman, and that's deliberate for two reasons. One is it would be completely undemocratic if we, if I decided what the policy should be, or if, the small number of people who are involved in Simpol were to try and sort of say, well, this is our policy, that wouldn't be democratic. And also it's completely impractical, because you need to see Simpol's evolution in this sort of a more extended time, in a more extended time frame. And by the time Simpol might get implemented, global circumstances could be quite different to what they are today. And therefore, to try and set policies now would be madness. So it's deliberately left open. And I mean, sometimes I describe it as a horse and cart. The cart is what policies do we need, and the horse is how do we get them delivered. And Simpol is like the horse, but the cart is at the moment empty, so that to invite people precisely to come into that space and say, well, okay, now we know that we can get these policies delivered. What could those policies actually be? And the process we envisage is a two-stage process. So the first stage is getting people on board, as I've discussed, and we're already doing that now. But when we've got enough in-principle buy-in from citizens and democratic countries, and maybe even some non-democratic countries, at that point, we would start a two-stage policy development process. So the first stage would be a national stage, where each independent nation, or in democratic countries, that would mean Simpol's supporting citizens. In non-democratic nations, it would just mean the government. They would independently work out, well, what are the 10 most pressing global issues from our national perspective? And what are the 10 policies that we think would be the best to solve them? Okay. And of course, it's important that you have that national stage, because there are different perspectives, different priorities in different countries. So it's important that those are identified by each country. And then the second stage would be when you bring them all together for an international negotiation, at which point you start to sort out what we call policy packages. So under Simpol, we would envisage the implementation not of a single issue package, like the United Nations is trying to do now with climate change. We would envisage multi-issue packages. The reason for that is that what a nation might lose on one issue, it can gain on the other. And it's the lack of that multi-issue approach, which I think is one important reason why the UN process is failing. Because if you just take one issue, there's always going to be some nations that win, others that lose. And because there's only one issue, there's no opportunity for trade-offs. And so, of course, the losers don't cooperate. And so it all falls apart. So under Simpol, we're looking at a series of multi-issue packages implemented, maybe the first package on year 1, the second in year 3, the third in year 5, and so forth. And then there would be opportunities to modify previous packages as we go along. And so it would be in that second international negotiation where hopefully these policy packages could be worked out and the precise policy details agreed. Now, the other thing I should say, Layman, is especially for viewers in the US and Canada, we are not talking about a one-size-fits-all policy. Okay, we're not saying that all nations would do exactly the same thing. No, what we're saying is that each nation would know what every other nation is going to do, so that there is transparency and so that every nation knows what the impact on its economic competitiveness is going to be, right? And this is the problem now with the UN process. It's usually, you know, with the COP process on climate change, it's all about targets, right? But no, you know, so they agree a target of cutting emissions by X% or whatever, right? But the problem is that no nation knows what every other nation is going to actually do to achieve those targets. And so they all remain suspicious of each other. They don't know what everyone else is going to do, what every other nation is going to do. They don't know how it's going to impact on their competitiveness. And so they do nothing, right? Or do very little.
So that kind of transparency, like obviously it has a role in making nations and markets feel stable, like they know what's going to happen. But it seems like it also has a big role to play in developing international trust, because all of this depends on increasing international trust.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, the first stage of actually getting politicians and citizens signed up is the first part of that trust. So for example, in the UK, we have just over 100 members of parliament from right across the party spectrum who've signed up to this. And I'm very proud of that, I think, because it shows that, you know, Simpol really can and does transcend and include, you know, and that is part of that trust process, that we are all in this together, you know. So we're getting away from the postmodern green level blaming and shaming kind of way of thinking to one where we recognize that we're all caught in destructive global competition at one level or another. And we all need to, you know, we all need to stop blaming each other and start working together.
I like that it tries to exploit the existing structures of the world, right? Like there are some good arguments to be made for getting rid of first past the post voting as an insufficient way of integrating the collective intelligence of a body of people. But a lot of places have that, so how can we take advantage of it, right? We can't require China to cease being China before we make any progress. We've got to take the systems as they're given and figure out how to turn them toward benevolence at this higher scale. Absolutely.
I'm so glad you see that, and that's precisely what we are trying to do. And you know, the way in which Simpol invites citizens to use their vote in their national elections provides exactly that opportunity, because I think one of the problems with game A, game B kind of thinking is that if you create a game B, you immediately make it's in opposition to game A. What you've got to do is to transform game A and turn it into game B, right? And you can only do that politically if you can work through the existing national electoral systems without being a political party. In other words, without actually becoming identified with those systems. And Simpol doesn't do that. Simpol is above. In fact, it brings the existing political parties and members of parliament into competition with each other. So it kind of turbocharges party political competition to produce global cooperation, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. There's the role of the so-called lower right quadrant in integral thinking is sort of debated, because it's easy to look at world systems and say we've been dominated by systems approaches and we've left out spirituality, we've left out mutuality. But at the higher levels that we're trying to help emerge, we haven't really paid much attention to systemic dynamics. Well, so I think there's coming out of green or pluralistic kind of ecologically aware thinking, a lot of people take the responsibility on themselves And that's sort of encouraged by the system. I recently watched a Netflix documentary about international fisheries. I grew up in a fishing village, so I knew some of it and knew some of the players. But the degree to which the international fisheries are playing a role in the potential rapid destabilization of the entire ecosystem is enormous. But the punchline of the film was individual consumers should stop eating fish.
Yeah.
And that's so far away from the scale of the problem that it's almost laughable.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, Layman. And this is it. I think because and this is another example, I think, of nation-centric versus world-centric thinking. If you don't see destructive competition and you don't see the world-centric, you don't see Simpol, what have you got left? You're sort of left with incompetent governments that can't act. Even you may not understand why, but they can't do it. And then, well, we can try to get the corporations to act properly, but oh well, at least we can change our buying habits. So it reduces the lower quadrants to the upper quadrants in a sense, and portrays, like exactly as you said, it portrays it as an individual responsibility issue, when actually individual action on a systemic problem like this is just a distraction, frankly. And, I'm not saying that individual action is, that one should ignore it. It's important, but it's almost beside the point. The collective action piece, that's exactly the piece that Simpol provides. It's exactly that missing piece. And ideally, we should do both. You should support Simpol and stop eating the worst kind of fish. So it's not an either or. It's a both and.
There's some interesting general themes and principles that I see running through all of this. Obviously, one of them is simultaneity, which has a role to play in higher cognition as well as higher political and economic changes. Another one is reversal of competition dynamics. Like, it seems to me we're describing a situation in which instead of the market being a place where corporations compete to provide well-being and innovation, nations are competing to service corporations. So there's an inversion of competition there. But there's also this sense of, instead of say getting politicians to have to compete for the Simpol vote. So there's a number of areas in which the vision you're putting forward involves a space of alternative competitive reversals. And I'm wondering how significant you think that is to higher consciousness, and also when did you start to detect patterns? When did you start to see into a space like that?
To your first question, yes, it's full of paradox. And I actually, a great Canadian guy, I think what was his name? Barrett, wrote a book called The Paradox Process, and in which he recognized that some of the most genius ideas were highly paradoxical. And just as you're describing, Layman, yeah, there are so many. So you've got the paradox that the governmental dog should be wagging the corporate tail. That's actually been turned on its head by destructive global competition, such that now it's the other way around. The corporate tail is wagging the government dog, and So I think often it's that process, coming back to the consciousness thing you were talking about earlier. It's that process of disidentifying. When you disidentify from that previous level and you see its contradictions, your first reaction is to feel powerless and to feel, oh my God, I'm falling. I can't do anything about this. And then you can actually say, but then you get to a new level where you say, well, actually, you know what? Now that I've become a bit powerless here, I can actually have a bit of fun with this and turn the tables on it altogether, And that's exactly what Simpol supporters are doing. So just to give you one example, Layman, there's one particular parliamentary, well, there's a number actually, but there's a parliamentary constituency area in the west of England, which is highly marginal. So it's been won and lost on about 150 votes, quite typically. And at one of the elections, I can't remember the ones we fought, whether it was the last one or the one before, but it was about 2 weeks before the election, and I think we got the Green Party candidate to sign up. And then it was great because one of our supporters down there, he rang me up and he said, "John, this is great because now we've got them all by the balls." And sure enough, once one signs up, because the margins are so tight in that constituency, and we never tell the candidates how many supporters we have in the area, we keep them guessing. And so the Green Party signed up, then the Liberal Democrat, then the Labour, and then the Conservative. And so they all signed up. So 2 weeks before the election was due, we knew we'd won that seat anyhow, in the sense that we knew that whoever won would be a pledged Simpol member of Parliament. So, we can actually turn the tables very, very effectively. And I think in systems theory or in chaos theory, I think Ervin Laszlo talks about a critical system is often very, very finely matched, like in the US election in 2000, or even, the last election between Trump and Clinton, the more critical the system becomes, the more evenly matched both main factions are. And that means that something like Simpol can tip the balance very easily, or relatively easily. And so that's the exciting potential, I think, that Simpol has. But we need citizens to get with it, to realize that they have this power to influence the situation very powerfully. And that's quite a big task, I think. Sorry, I didn't answer the other part of your question, Layman. I've completely forgotten it now. Sorry.
Do you feel like you're seeing into a space where these structures are contained, these kinds of paradoxical shapes? Yeah. And like, when do you feel like you started to really pay attention to patterns of this kind?
Well, it was actually, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was actually back in 2098, and it was basically an altered state experience, as from what I can understand now. I was having lunch with my family and my kids were talking about climate change because they were covering it at school. And at the end of the meal, my mum sort of turned around and said, "Well, John, what would you do about climate change?" And in that moment, I was sort of aware of somehow going inside myself in a very almost ruthless way, and then into that emptiness popped this enormously powerful realization that and it was on my lips, it would have to happen simultaneously. But it wasn't the words, it was the whole feeling behind it, Layman. At the time, I couldn't even put it into words because it was like a unity consciousness experience. And the idea that it wasn't just about nations acting simultaneously so that nobody would lose out. It was also the whole idea that when you're stuck in a vicious circle, the articulation of us simultaneously implementing something together kind of opens up a new context which wasn't there before, and that actually we could simultaneously carry on competing in this context, as we kind of must, while still talking about developing, building, and negotiating what we are going to do together in the new context to take us to that new level, to take us to the new world that we need to, we all need to reach. So, yeah, so it was a very, very powerful, so it was right back in that moment, it was a split-second moment, and ever since then, I've sort of been, my brain has been rewiring itself to actually see what it really meant. So yeah, it was, but so it really all happened in a split-second moment. It was all there, but it took me sort of many, many years to sort of really make sense of it and to read around the topic of, because I'm just a paper salesman. I'm not a politician or anything like that. So to read around, I didn't have any particular interest in global affairs. So I had to do a lot of reading to sort of see, well, does this idea really make any sense? And I thought, well, if it's that good of an idea, probably someone else has already thought of it already anyhow. But the more I read, the more I realized that it was relevant and that nobody had thought about it. And we've gone on from there, building slowly. But it is a slow process because consciousness is slow. And many of the kind of organizations I thought would be very supportive of this, I discovered don't really get it. So that's the sort of, I think that's the challenge we have in trying to help the green level come up, basically.
So some of that challenge is cognitive, but some of it's emotional. And there's a great deal in the Simpol book about the stages of loss and sort of grieving the death of over-identification with nation states. Do you feel like you've gone through a process like that yourself?
Yes, Layman. Yeah, I mean, I think it's more an identification, not so much with nation states. It's more, well, it sort of is. It's more. I think for the postmodern level, as expressed through politics and activism, it's more about letting go of the us versus them. We're the good guys. Politicians and corporations are the bad guys. It's letting go of that and realizing that actually governments and corporations are doing what they're doing because they're stuck in the vicious circle of destructive global competition like everybody else. But that is quite that's a very powerful identification that green has, that the postmodern level has. And often I think to many of them, their worldview, their modus operandi is, well, if we just protest loud enough and long enough, we will get the government to do what we want. And Simpol is really saying, well, actually, you know what? You won't. And the last 40 years of activism have demonstrated that. And now is the time to, you really need to understand that it's not that governments don't want to act. It's that destructive global competition means that they can't act. But to most people at the postmodern level, they would see Simpol, all nations acting together, that's just going to delay action, they would say. We need it now. That's why we've got to get out on the streets and. So it's a very it's a very different way of thinking, and it's been. I didn't realize. Well, I only started to realize what I was up against when I started to read Ken Wilber and spiral dynamics, and then I understood what we were up against. And also, it's helped in my education, because I think even though I had this altered state idea 20 years ago that was sort of teal, turquoise or whatever, my own state was still pretty postmodern, actually. And so I've had a 20 years of actually trying to get this rewired, as it were, get myself rewired. And it's not easy, it's not easy.
No, it's very, It's interesting to think about ideas in which we're rapidly approaching a critical mass, a tipping point of advanced thinkers who will have the consciousness necessary to instinctively implement these things. But when you think about how long it takes and how urgent the crises are, and how long it takes for people who get the ideas to actually get there in their being, we really wonder whether we have the time to get people authentically there. And obviously, we have to work on that. But at the same time, people who are in the vanguard have to be producing systems that can operate in excess of the individuals and also help the individuals along by participating in that system.
Exactly, and that's we've come round much more to that way of thinking, actually, or I have. When we started, I thought, well, we'll get lots of citizens signed up to this, then that'll drive the politicians to sign up, then we'll get the parties, and then we'll get government. And what I discovered was that actually citizens don't get it very easily, and that's partly why I focused on the integral community, because I thought, oh, but that section of society, that small section, does have the capacity to understand it, and most of the people in Simpol, many of them are integral or spiral dynamics people. But given that citizens more generally are rather slow, what we found, in fact, is that politicians are much more open to it, not just because of the voting incentive that we give them, but we've got many, you'll see on our website, I mean, there are many comments we've had from politicians all over the world who genuinely appreciate this idea. They say, thank you, at last someone's come up with a solution to our biggest problem, which is, on the one hand, we want to save, solve climate change and what have you, but on the other, we've got to keep Britain internationally competitive, and we're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, So to many politicians, actually, Simpol resonates quite well with them. And so our strategy really is, yes, we want citizens to come on board, because ultimately we've got to have citizens, but we are also focusing quite strongly on getting politicians signed up, so that I think as the crisis builds, at the end of the day, the buck is going to stop with the politicians, right? At the end of the day, they're the ones that everyone's going to look to act. And that's why we hope that by doing what we're doing, getting Simpol under their noses, when they've got to act, and they maybe see that the UN process isn't a solution, oh, what's this Simpol thing that I've been looking at for the last, oh yeah, actually that could be a solution. So, I mean, we're trying all sorts of ways, but we're focused on citizens, but we're also focused on the politicians themselves as well. So we'll see.
There are a number of existing international organizations. Some of them are like the WTO, and some of them are like the UN, and some of them are like teams of NGOs. And we've talked about some of the reasons why the UN is unsuccessful, because it's not dealing with packages of issues in which trade-offs can be negotiated. But why can't these problems in general get solved by existing international organizations? And then also, what will the role of those existing organizations be in the implementation of Simpol? Do they have a role in that going forward?
Yeah, they would, and I'll explain in a minute. I mean, the problem with international organizations at the moment, Layman, I think, is that they're subtly nation-centric. I mean, who designed the United Nations? Nation states, right? And so that it was purposely designed in a way that didn't give the United Nations itself any autonomous power over the member nations. That it was deliberately designed not to be an effective global body. Why? Because it was designed by Britain, France, the US, and Russia, and the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And when it comes to, and the same goes, I think, for the IMF and the World Bank, they are basically the main shareholders are the strongest nation states, who all have their own interests and blah, blah, blah. When it comes to the World Trade Organization, that has a more egalitarian structure. But actually, I gave a talk there many years ago, and it's quite funny because the US has a sort of delegation to the World Trade Organization, about 600 people, like lawyers and trade specialists and doctors, but most of these developing countries, they've just got one guy and a secretary. They just haven't got a chance, basically. And so, although the World Trade Organization is in principle more egalitarian, it's not really. And it's also just dealing with trade, and I think this is part of the problem is if you think of what a national government does, it's integrating trade, society, and environment. Okay, those three broad spheres are the purpose of government is to integrate those three interests and to sort of somehow make them work together. But at the global level, you've got the World Trade Organization just looking at trade, and of course then you've got so the World Trade Organization, of course, being peopled by all sorts of clever guys who of course have been educated at Harvard and thoroughly inculcated with neoliberal free market economics. It's not surprising that their prescriptions are, well, if something's going wrong, well, it's because it's still too regulated. We need to deregulate it even more. So it just the current international organizations just are not configured to get us out of the mess that we're in, and unfortunately, neither is the United Nations. So that's sort of why Simpol is relevant, is because the existing organizations just can't do it. They're not configured to do it. Coming on to the second part of your question, I think there certainly would be ways. I would foresee, for example, that something like the World Trade Organization, the International Labour Organization, the International Criminal Court, all of these could be built in to a sort of Simpol structure driven by citizens, ultimately with citizens, at least in democratic countries, having the final say. And I think they could be incorporated. I mean, I don't know exactly how, but I'm that they perform a function, but that function would just need to be sort of transformed a bit, and then they would need to be brought into a more integrated framework, which they're not at the moment.
One of the things I love about Simpol is it seems to require or enable an expansion of empathy, right? It's very easy to look at the fact that national governments are failing and to look at a problem associated with international corporate action and decide that either politicians or the owners of corporations are the villains. But this is a model in which they're not necessarily the villains, in which they're driven by structural incentives and where we can bring them into the fold, so to speak. And I think that's a very powerful moral extension of this concept.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's, my business background is I'm sure an important reason why I came up with the idea, because I know as a business, I was talking to Jim Rutt about this as well, and he said the same thing, is that as business people, we know that, we may want to behave as ethically as we can, but there are times when, because of competitive pressure, you just got no choice, basically. You have to, if you don't kick 10 people out today and you leave the situation, you might have to kick 50 out tomorrow, And so it becomes a least, the least worst option of a bunch of bad options, basically. And, you've got to keep, at the end of the day, you've got to keep your business competitive and profitable. And if you are at times under enormous pressure, you just simply don't have the choice. And so I think that it's important that we understand that people generally, yes, of course, there are some evil bastards out there. There's no question about that. But generally speaking, I don't think it's that business people are evil people or want to do the wrong thing or whatever, most of them, or the same with politicians. They are just constrained by the competitive system that we all find ourselves in. And so I sometimes think Simpol is just about two things. It's about forgiving ourselves and each other, and it's about taking responsibility. That's it. And the forgiving ourselves and each other is very much what you're saying, Layman, is realizing that we are all caught in this system. It's killing us all, frankly, and will kill us all. And even the Bill Gateses right at the top of the system, or the Jeff Bezoses, couldn't change it, even if they wanted to. They couldn't do it alone. Ultimately, only governments working together can change it. They've got to become the dog that wags the tail, and we've got to help them get there.
So what changes could nation states make within themselves unilaterally that would help this process along?
Well, very, very few. This is the point. Often that question, Layman, short of signing on to Simpol, there's very little that they, and engaging in the UN process and the OECD and all of that. Short of that, there is actually very little they can do. That's the point. We are now at a stage with globalization and the free movement of capital that the space for unilateral action is being squeezed down to next to nothing. And that's why politicians continually say they will do stuff, but they don't do it because they can't do it. But they need to keep saying they'll do it because they've got to try to maintain the illusion that they have the power, and they don't. They really don't. I'm not saying they can't do anything, but I'm just saying that the space for unilateral action on global issues is now very, very, very so small as to be, it's a distraction, I believe.
I'm curious about your take on healthy nationalism, because it seems like there's a role for shared ethos, for pride, and maybe even because nations and before them kingdoms have had predatory relationships with each other. And I think, we might be foolish to let our guard down, so to speak. So,
yeah.
Obviously there can be a real problem with national chauvinism, and it's holding back some of the energy that would go to make changes at the planetary scale. But what do you see as good nationalism?
Well, I completely agree with you, Layman. And this again is where Simpol and destructive global competition, that thinking is so valuable, because if you use that differentiation tool, let's call it, you can differentiate those policies or actions that a nation can implement alone without causing it a competitive disadvantage, and those other policies that it can't implement alone because it would cause a competitive disadvantage. And that separation is, in a sense, the separation between the national and the global. Okay, so anything that we can do unilaterally without causing ourselves a competitive disadvantage, that's the healthy national role. And anything that we need to do with other nations to get it done without suffering a competitive, in other words, all the Simpol type policies, we can support those too. That's our healthy global identity. if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you start thinking like that, you can start to see that, oh yeah, you know, if nations cooperated to tax these multinationals and could actually use some of that money to support Central American countries and other developing countries, you know, so we wouldn't be paying for it. Those corporations essentially would be paying for it, or financial markets, you know, or the super wealthy would be paying for that. You know, that actually would support stronger national identities everywhere. So it's what I call the difference between multiculturalism at the green postmodern level and what I call simulculturalism. Okay, that's where all nations are supported by a cooperatively governed global economy that is fair to everybody, and also supports the weaker nations in everyone's interests, so that they, you know, because often what's happening now, you know, look at Britain. Our health service wouldn't run without immigrants from India and Africa and all sorts of other places. But often those people are the brightest brains those countries have. And how can those countries develop if those brains are being sucked into the developed world? You know, so it's just ultimately not in our interests, and that's what I think. You know, that's where you can support healthy national identities are supported by supporting global cooperation. So again, it's a both and. It's not the nationalist globalist dichotomy that people think it is, if you move up to a world-centric level of consciousness. If you don't, you know, you're lost.
You mentioned Ken Wilber, you mentioned Irvin Laszlo. Who else, you know, who do you read? Who are you taking as an important source of information? Are you reading David Sloan Wilson, or, you know, what are your idea sources?
Yeah, David Sloan Wilson is a strong supporter as well. But Ken Wilber has been very important. But one of the ones who you may not know of, Layman, is John Stewart, the evolutionary biologist who wrote, Australian guy, who wrote Evolution's Arrow, the direction of evolution and the
very
future.
peripherally aware of him.
Yeah, and so he's a fascinating thinker. I believe there's on our YouTube channel. There's an interview with him and me together, which you might find quite interesting. And he wrote to me back in like 2001 or 2 and said to me, I don't know whether you realize it, John, but Simpol is it mimics the way that evolution has overcome competition bottlenecks in the past. And at that time, I didn't know what the fuck he was talking about. I read his book, but then, you know, he really helped me to see the evolutionary context for Simpol and how important it was in that context. So he in a sense gave me the outer quadrant knowledge. Ken gave me the inner quadrant knowledge. You know, so John Stewart, I would say, is important, very important. Yeah, David Sloan Wilson, Ken, you know, Don Beck to some degree, and you know the other guys who you will know pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I imagine that John Stewart's thinking will play a role if you end up engaging Brett Weinstein on this. John Stewart's ideas will provide a context for that. I'm curious what is it that you appreciate about David Sloan Wilson? What parts of his ideas do you think are really resonant with this?
Well, I think his focus on Elinor Ostrom's 8 design principles for pro-social cooperative ventures, and I think, you know, when David read my book, the Simpol Solution that you've just read, he recognized that. And also his idea of polycentric governance, you know, the idea that it's subsidiarity, the idea of subsidiarity, that you only decide those things at the lowest possible level, at the most local possible level. And again, that's something that is an inherent part of Simpol in this differentiation I was talking about earlier. If it's a policy nations can implement alone without, where it either will create no competitive disadvantage or even a competitive advantage, it has nothing to do with Simpol. It can be decided at the national level. It's only those policies that can't be implemented alone, that nations would like to implement but can't because of competition. Those are the Simpol ones. So there's a very, the whole subsidiarity thing is built into Simpol.
Yeah, I appreciate part of your
foundations.
Right.
Yeah.
The idea of, because I think people aren't clear enough about that in their discussions with each other, that subsidiary means solve everything at the lowest possible scale that it can be solved at, and that is what clarifies the residual things that have to be solved at a higher scale.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that confuses people is that because the global level governance hasn't yet been put in place, the arising toxicity of that chaos is trickling down to all the lower levels. And that's making people think, oh, well, we've got to do this, it's confusing people. And that's one of the reasons I think people are not yet, they don't yet understand that without solving the global level piece in the puzzle, you're never going to solve the rest, because that poison is going to keep on trickling down and confusing everything. And,
What does an effective and affirmable planetary governance process look like in distinction from a planetary government?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and this is another thing. I always love to. I mean, you're in Canada, but if I'm talking to Jim or anyone in the US, I'm always very careful to say that Simpol is not a world government. It's more like a global treaty. You would say a citizen-driven global treaty, freely entered into by nation states for the simple reason that it's in their interests to enter into it. It's in their national self-interest to cooperate. And so Simpol is not about a world government, God forbid, because we don't actually need one. I don't think we need one. I think the Simpol process is a kind of, it's a tool for global cooperation that is there, that can be used by nations on an ongoing basis without the need for a world government.
What lessons, for good or ill, should we take away from the European Economic Union? What do you think they got right, and what do you think they got wrong as an international setup?
It's a good question. I think, again, the European Union suffers from the same or a similar problem to the United Nations. And that is that the European Parliament cannot actually create new laws. It can only approve or disapprove laws that are proposed by the European Commission. Who is the Commission? The nation states, right? Because the nation state, the national governments know damn well that if the European Commission didn't keep control, their role would be gone, right? And so that's, there is a lack of democracy in the European Union that is just as there is in the UN. And that's one problem with it. I think the other problem with it is it's a bit, its design is rather 19th or 20th century. It's still built on the model of a nation's, just a super nation state. And that is just, it's too rigid. It's too rigid. And that, that's part of the problem. So, and I think that's why something like Simpol, I mean, funnily enough, Layman, actually, one of the, few years ago, one of the high up politicians in UKIP, with the UK Independence Party, which was the party of Nigel Farage, Actually, he contacted me because they were quite interested in Simpol, because they kind of realized that they wanted to get rid of the EU, right? They wanted Brexit and they want to get rid of the EU, but they also kind of realized that, well, if we get rid of the EU, we're still going to need some kind of framework through which we can cooperate with other governments on global problems. So they, even parties on the right, I think, are seeing, they see something in Simpol, not only actually that it's a way to safeguard healthy national identity, but it's also a way to facilitate cooperation at the global level in a way that is maximally in every nation's self-interest, rather than under some kind of, draconian top-down European Union or world government or something like that.
Well, speaking of draconians, there's traditionally an in-between condition between kingdoms and nations and the world, and that's empires, right? Collections of countries that don't cover the whole planet, but, right? Britain obviously is one of them. Russia has been one of them. The United States in its own way has been this thing. Do you think they are, an important negotiating step on that road, or do they have to break up into more ethnically and geographically homogenous subunits? Like, does Simpol work better if the Kurds have a state? Does Simpol work better if the Scots decide to step away from the United Kingdom, right? Or Quebec from Canada? Does that make a difference?
No, it makes no difference to us at all. We if Scotland left the United Kingdom, it'd just be another country with another website for us, and we follow the same process regardless. It makes absolutely no difference to us. So, Simpol is really, that's the flexibility of it, is that it really doesn't matter what happens in that regard. We still, we still operate. We have politicians signed up that are in the European Parliament. We have them signed up if they're in national parliaments. So either which way, it doesn't really matter. But I think in a more general sense, I think, we are entering a phase of fragmentation now. And I think that is because of the imbalance between a globalized economy, but governance that's only on the national level. And that imbalance is creating this fragmentation now. Not only, Britain leaving the European Union, for example, but also within nations. For example, in Spain, you've got Catalonia wanting to go independent, because nation states are not cooperating and are not able to deal with global problems, that some of their sub-regions are beginning to ask themselves, well, what's the point of being part of Spain? What's the point of being, a state within a nation state if the nation state can't protect our interests? So this is the poison that's trickling down, you see, from the global level, from the lack of, and it's not, it annoys me, Layman, when people say things like, well, we need a new kind of economy, we need a new global economy. I think, no, we don't. There's nothing, the economy is doing exactly what you would expect it to do without governance on the same scale. So it's the governance piece that we need. If you have the governance piece, that will imbue to the global economy the values of sustainability and fairness and redistribution stuff, all of the stuff we know we need. It's not the economy itself, really, that needs to change. It's the governance that's missing.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that the economy can function, and there's actually a lot of solutions to all of our problems that already exist. In the United States, for example, there's a ton of laws that should be governing things much better that just simply aren't being implemented or enforced because the pressures and incentives aren't there to operate them properly. And one of the things I really enjoy about the book is this notion of matching the scale of cooperation to the scale of competition. Right. So that if they work together, we have a good form of competition. And right now, competition has exceeded the nation level, but the cooperative principles have not matched them.
Absolutely. I mean, just imagine, Layman, you had an ice hockey game, but the referee could only ref just one corner of it. Can you imagine what would go on in the rest of the?
Is that example trying to relate to me as a Canadian?
That was my rather half-hearted British attempt at intercultural understanding. Yeah.
Not bad, not bad. I don't want to sully the procedural purity of Simpol, but I am interested in what you as an individual think would be important policies to change. If it was autocratically up to you, what would you try to do?
Well, I personally, I think it's on our website, we don't have specific policies, but what we do list are a list of issues the issues that are going to require a Simpol type approach. So climate change, wealth inequality, financial market regulation, vaccine production and fair vaccine production distribution. What else? Space governance. They're having trouble getting satellites up there because there's so much space junk out, in the orbital layers that it's actually becoming quite dangerous. So there's a sort of pollution problem up there now as well. So there's, we are listing issues at this stage, Layman. I wouldn't. What policies, I mean, the kind of policy I could envisage would be something like a package consisting of a strong emissions reduction, a global emissions reduction agreement, but on the other side, some kind of global tax. It might be a currency transactions tax, it might be a wealth tax, it might be a hike in corporation tax like Janet Yellen has suggested. But the idea being that the proceeds from the tax you can use to pay off the big losers on the climate part of the agreement. So something like that could be Simpol 1. And actually, one of the projects we have on at the moment, we're trying to find a university to do a proper university study on that scenario. So if we want to reduce emissions by, say, 80% by a certain date, what would that cost? What would the tax, how high would the tax have to be to cover that cost? And then maybe some scenarios on how the proceeds of the tax could be distributed in the most efficient and fair way to nation by nation to make the highest chance of getting an agreement. So those are the kind of studies that we're looking at getting done as ideas for what the policies could look like. But it's still very open, and we're still waiting. We'd love some computer modelers and policy experts to help us to put some flesh on those bones. Because I think you're right. I think often people, it's a bit abstract without that, and I understand that. I understand that problem. So, but we need help. We need the experts to come in and help us.
Yeah, we need good collective intelligent solutions.
Yeah.
And at the same time, everybody else other than Simpol is putting forward their policy agenda rather than looking at the implementation dynamics.
Exactly. And this is what I mean about the horse and the cart. They're all focused on the cart, but they've got no bloody way to get it implemented. And that's, it's when we start putting those two things together, the horse and the cart, then you've got something, then you really got both elements. But as you say, most people now, they're talking about, the policies are what we need is this policy for climate change or this policy for monetary reform or whatever it may be, but they are completely ignoring the how question. How do you get it implemented? And that's the piece that Simpol, I think, answers quite, reasonably well.
Obviously, multinational corporations can leverage their impact on national economies to win special treatment from governments. But do you think they also leverage the impression that they can do that? Like, if you had a corporation that, say, in the United States said, if you impose this slight tax increase, or if you put these regulations on us, we're just going to abandon this factory and all these workers and move to Mexico. Aren't there, a dozen corporations or companies in the waiting who would take that deal, who could replace that one? Is there an element of bravado, or is it always a real risk?
Well, it's both, I would say, Layman, because it's also an asymmetric power imbalance. Because if an individual corporation may have its own particular calculation in mind, and there will be many factors, so the corporation tax level will be one factor, but there will be lots of other factors in their decision making. But you see, governments, they've got to legislate for everybody, for all corporations. And so governments have got a much sort of more tricky balance to judge. And of course, they're scared. They are scared of they're losing jobs, and so it's not so easy for a government to say, well, if we set corporation tax at this level, this will happen or this won't happen. They can't, I don't think they can really judge that. They've got to sort of feel their way through to it. And of course, they are being bombarded all the time by the Cato Institute and all these, right-wing free market think tanks that are telling them, oh, don't do that because, that could be nasty for our competitive position and so forth. So there is some bravado and there is some reality. And I think it's very difficult for governments to really judge it. I mean, the one thing they certainly can't do, the only reason that some governments are really increasing corporation tax right now is in a sense because they're simultaneously up to their necks in debt because of COVID. And so there's a kind of window of opportunity where they can maybe do that without risking too much, But I think if the vaccine rollout continues to be very uneven, and if harmful vaccine-resistant mutations don't come back, then you're going to see a divergence between, you're going to see the US and maybe the UK and the European Union economies recovering quicker than the others, and then that window of opportunity for cooperation will be lost because you've then got the disparity again. And the winners are going to think, oh, well, we don't need to cooperate because we're moving ahead, never mind the others, to hell with the others, Whereas right now, there is an opportunity for cooperation. And I very much hope that they do it. But let's see.
Do you think one of the things that needs to be implemented simultaneously is a shift in the legal architecture of corporations? Like, is the maximization of shareholder value a reasonable thing, or does that have to be shifted? And does that shift it internationally?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, in a sense, if you had a global, if you had something like Simpol in place that was enforcing higher ethical standards and what have you on corporations everywhere, in a sense, you could go back to shareholder value. Do you see what I mean? In other words, if this is the Milton Friedman argument that the business of business is business. It's not the business of business to be socially responsible. And in a sense, he's right. In a very narrow kind of cut and dried sense, he is right. But that assumes that there is adequate governance in place, which there isn't right now at the global level. There is almost no referee, there is no governance. And so, but again, this is where I feel that the whole corporate social responsibility thing is a little bit of a distraction from what, from something like Simpol, which is what we really need, is to get the governance in place at the global level. And then what happens with shareholder value or stakeholder value doesn't matter so much. Then it becomes more a question of corporate reputation and, the usual pressure and blah, 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 blah. It's the governance piece that's the important thing.
There's an interesting thing in the book around the idea that as negotiations for international treaties were to emerge in this fashion, that proposals that come from or correspond to a world-centric state of consciousness, that those would be favored over traditionalist, modern, or postmodern policies because they would be the only broadly popular ones that weren't canceled out by one of the rivals. And that's a very attractive idea. But at the same time, we see in most of the nation states that the political process sort of gets hacked into this two-sided situation in which these two teams, neither of which represent the general interests of the population, are constantly vying for a very tiny advantage. What's to stop that from happening at the global level? What's to stop two non-world-centric options from dominating?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, Layman. we've got to get there to find out, I would say. But I suppose my general answer would be that cooperation happens when the crisis is high.
Right.
And I think that by the time something like Simpol was really getting negotiated, if we ever were to reach that point, things would be so bloody bad that no one would really be thinking about arguing too much about it. We just got to get it done, because the alternatives mean we're all going to go down the tubes. The other thing I would say is that again, it's the lack of differentiation at the national level caused by the lack of a global, but the lack of world-centric thinking that makes the national conversation so complicated, and so contentious. Because I think if green and orange and blue could suddenly become world-centric and would see, okay, well, we can take all of those global issues out of the conversation and throw them into Simpol and deal with them there, and then look back, well, what have we got left to argue about at the national level? They would discover, well, actually, there's stuff to argue about, but it's not nearly so contentious and so divisive. And so, you will always
take a lot of pressure out of the system.
Yes, I think it would just take a lot of pressure out of the system, and at the global level, likewise, I think the fact that you have this subsidiarity filter means that, so the kind of very, very contentious issues, say it might be like abortion or capital punishment or something like that, and you think, well, Simpol sorts that out immediately, because you sort of say, well, would capital punishment need to be implemented globally and simultaneously? Or could it be implemented by a nation on its own? Well, obviously, it can be implemented by a nation on its own, so it's got nothing to do with Simpol. So that filter, the same with gender, the same with abortion, the same with so many cultural issues, they are not issues that require global and simultaneous action. And therefore, there's a whole swathe of those very highly contentious issues which wouldn't even enter the, they just get
filtered out already.
Yeah, they get pre-filtered. Yeah, because they just don't require simultaneous implementation. Simple, So I think it would simplify a lot of the debate at both levels, actually. But there's no guarantees, Layman. I don't know. There's no certainty that it will succeed. The only brief I hold for Simpol is kind of like, do we have a better idea? Really, it's not. It's more in that spirit.
Well, if we don't have a better idea, how do we help it succeed? If people are watching or listening, regardless of what country they're in, what can they do to assist this project?
Very simple. Just sign up at simpol.org. It takes a couple of minutes, and that's the minimum. But if you want to get involved, we need people to get involved in campaigning, in getting campaigns going in countries where we don't yet have representation. So yeah, just signing up is the minimum, but there's a lot more beyond that you can do if you wish. But you've got to sign up, because if you don't sign up, the signing up bit is the evidence that we can then show to your political representative to say, here is a voter that is going to give preference to candidates at future elections, to candidates that have signed on to Simpol. So there's that you're signing on to Simpol is sending a message, an incentive message to your political representative. So if you don't sign on, they're not going to hear about it, and they need to hear about it.
Terrific. This has been a really enlivening conversation. I appreciate your vision. I appreciate how balanced and pragmatic you sound. I think
you thought I was a crazy.
Well, you can't tell. You can't tell when you check yourself if you're crazy or not. so my feedback is you don't sound
a good act. Put on a good act. Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Layman. It's lovely to have a slightly more in-depth conversation about it, because on the one hand, it's a simple concept. On the other hand, actually, there's so much going on in it that it does take a little bit of teasing apart.